Imagine a material so coveted that its trade routes defined the shape of the known world, yet its origin was so mysterious that the most learned scholars of the Mediterranean believed it grew on the leaves of trees like a fine golden moss. In the year 552, the Roman Empire, or what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was facing an existential crisis that had nothing to do with barbarians at the gates or plagues in the streets. It was a crisis of fabric. To understand the gravity of the Byzantine silk heist, one must first understand that in the 6th century, silk was not merely a luxury, it was the very currency of power, the literal thread that held the social hierarchy together. Emperor Justinian I, a man whose ambitions were as vast as the Mediterranean itself, found himself in a suffocating economic vice. His empire was draped in silk, from the flowing robes of the senators to the sacred hangings of the newly completed Hagia Sophia, yet he did not own a single ounce of the secret behind its creation. Every thread, every shimmering tunic, and every translucent veil had to be purchased from the East, passing through the greedy, calloused hands of the Sassanid Persians, the Romans' greatest geopolitical rivals. The geopolitical landscape of 552 was a delicate balance of attrition. Justinian had spent decades attempting to reconquer the lost provinces of the West, pouring gold into the hands of generals like Belisarius and Narses to reclaim Italy and North Africa. But while the Roman legions were winning battles on the ground, the Roman treasury was losing a silent war on the markets. The Silk Road was less a road and more a series of high-stakes toll booths, and the Sassanids held the keys to the most lucrative gates. King Khosrow I of Persia knew exactly how much the Romans loved their silk, and he taxed the trade with a merciless efficiency that would make a modern IRS auditor weep with envy. By the time a bale of raw silk reached the workshops of Tyre or Beirut, its price had been inflated by 1,000%. Justinian tried to bypass the Persians by seeking maritime routes through the Red Sea, hoping the Aksumite kingdom in modern-day Ethiopia could act as middlemen. But the Persian navy was too dominant, and the Indian Ocean trade winds were fickle allies. The emperor was desperate. He needed a miracle, or failing that, he needed the greatest act of industrial espionage in the history of the ancient world. Enter the protagonists of our story, 2 nameless monks belonging to the Nestorian Church. History has not preserved their birth names, but their legacy is etched into every silken garment produced in Europe for the next millennium. These were men who had traveled further than any Roman soldier, having spent years in the distant lands of Serindia, a place we now identify with the regions of Central Asia, or perhaps even the fringes of the Chinese Empire. They arrived at the great palace of Constantinople not as warriors or diplomats, but as humble travelers with dust on their sandals and a secret that could topple an empire's monopoly. When they were granted an audience with Justinian, they did not speak of theology or the salvation of souls. Instead, they spoke of worms. They explained to a stunned emperor that silk was not gathered from trees, nor was it a type of processed wool from a legendary desert sheep. It was, they claimed, the byproduct of a specific type of caterpillar that gorged itself on mulberry leaves until it spun a golden shroud for itself. Justinian, a man of cold intellect and pragmatic ruthlessness, immediately saw the potential. If he could possess these worms, he could bypass the Persian middlemen forever. He could turn the Byzantine Empire into a manufacturing powerhouse, keeping the gold of the West within his own borders. But the problem was logistical and biological. The silk-producing regions were thousands of miles away, guarded by strict export bans. In China, the penalty for revealing the secret of sericulture or attempting to smuggle the silkworms out of the country was a slow and agonizing death. The monks proposed a heist of breathtaking simplicity and terrifying risk. They suggested that they return to the east, infiltrate the silk-producing centers, and steal the means of production. However, they couldn't just bring back the caterpillars. The insects would die long before they reached the Bosphorus. They couldn't bring back the adult moths. They were too fragile. They needed to steal the eggs. The plan required a level of patience that few could muster. The monks would have to travel across the rugged terrain of the Hindu Kush, navigate the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert, and bypass the watchful eyes of Persian border guards who were specifically trained to look for smuggled contraband. Justinian promised them a reward that would ensure their order's prosperity for centuries, but the price of failure was a shallow grave in a forgotten wasteland. The monks accepted. They prepared for their journey not with swords or shields, but with hollowed-out bamboo walking staves. These staves were the perfect disguise. To a weary border guard, they were merely tools to help an old man walk, but to the monks, they were the cargo holds for a treasure more valuable than a mountain of emeralds. As they departed Constantinople in the spring of 552, the air was beginning to warm, and the mulberry trees in the palace gardens were budding with fresh green leaves. Justinian watched them leave from the height of his terrace, knowing that the future of the Roman economy was literally walking away on the backs of two elderly men. The stakes were absolute. If the monks were caught, the Sassanids would use the incident as a casus belli to launch another devastating war. If they disappeared into the vastness of the East, the emperor would be mocked as a fool who chased fables. But if they succeeded, the very texture of history would change. The journey would take years. They would have to time their theft perfectly, waiting for the brief window when the silkworm eggs were laid but had not yet hatched. They would have to keep the eggs cool and dormant through the blistering heat of the desert, and warm enough to survive the freezing mountain passes. It was a heist that required the precision of a jeweler and the nerves of a spy, all hidden under the drab, unassuming robes of the faithful. Thus, the two monks vanished into the rising sun, leaving behind a city of marble and gold that was quite literally hanging by a thread.
The monks did not travel with the fanfare of a military expedition or the visible wealth of a diplomatic convoy. To any observer along the dusty arteries of the Silk Road, they were merely two more aging peregrines, their faces weathered by the sun, and their spirits seemingly anchored in the divine. Yet, beneath their calloused feet lay thousands of miles of some of the most treacherous terrain on the planet, and within their minds lay a mission of industrial espionage that would make a modern intelligence officer recoil. Their first great hurdle was the Sassanid Empire. Under the rule of Khosrow I, the Persians were not merely trade partners with Byzantium, they were the gatekeepers of the world's most precious commodity. Every ounce of silk that reached the markets of Constantinople passed through Persian hands, and every transaction padded the Sassanid treasury with a heavy tax. The Persians protected this monopoly with a ruthlessness born of economic necessity. They were the wall through which the monks had to pass, and they were a wall with 1,000 eyes. The monks opted for a northern route, skirting the direct paths that were heavily monitored by Persian border guards. They moved through the rugged landscapes of the Transoxiana region, a territory where the influence of the great king of Persia blurred into the shifting allegiances of Central Asian nomadic tribes. Travel in the 6th century was a grueling exercise in logistics. A single day's progress was measured in the stamina of one's sandals and the availability of potable water. The monks relied on the network of Nestorian Christian communities that dotted the Silk Road like small beacons of familiarity in a vast alien landscape. These communities provided more than just prayer. They provided the boring essentials of survival: bread, salted meat, and intelligence on which mountain passes were currently blocked by snow or bandits. By the time the monks reached the borders of what the Romans called Serinda, likely the kingdom of Khotan, or perhaps the fringes of the Wei dynasty's influence, nearly a year had passed. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological burden was greater. They were now in the heart of the mystery. For centuries, the West had speculated on the origin of silk. Some thought it was the hair of a rare sea creature. Others believed it was a fine down harvested from the leaves of specific trees. As the monks observed the local industries, the mundane reality was far more fascinating. They saw the vast plantations of mulberry trees, their broad, heart-shaped leaves swaying in the breeze. They watched as laborers, with a rhythmic patience that bordered on the meditative, tended to thousands of small, pale, wriggling larvae. This was the Bombyx mori. It was not a grand beast of myth, but a specialized, domesticated moth that had, over millennia, lost the ability to fly or survive without human intervention. The monks realized that stealing the secret of silk was not about stealing a recipe, it was about stealing a biological cycle. They spent months observing the precise conditions required for the silkworms to thrive. They noted the temperature of the rearing rooms, the exact age at which the mulberry leaves must be harvested, and the critical moment when the larvae began to spin their cocoons of unbroken filament. To the monks, this was not just agriculture, it was a divine clockwork. But the clock was ticking against them. To bring this industry to Justinian, they could not simply take a handful of cocoons. A cocooned silkworm is a finished product, its transformative power trapped. They needed the eggs. The acquisition of the eggs was the centerpiece of the heist. Legend tells us they used hollowed-out bamboo staffs, a tool so common and unremarkable that no guard would think to inspect the interior. The choice of bamboo was a stroke of engineering genius. Bamboo is light, sturdy, and provides a natural insulation. However, the true challenge was the biology of the eggs themselves. Silkworm eggs are notoriously temperamental. If they are kept too warm, they hatch prematurely. If they hatch in the middle of a desert or a frozen mountain pass, the larvae will starve within hours, lacking the fresh mulberry leaves required for their survival. If the eggs are kept too cold for too long, they simply die. The monks had to become living incubators, using the warmth of their own bodies and the strategic layering of their robes to maintain a stable, dormant temperature for their stolen cargo. The theft occurred during the late spring.
the brief window when the moths had laid their eggs but before the summer heat could trigger the hatching process. With several thousand eggs tucked into the dark, hollow centers of their walking sticks, the monks turned their backs on the east. The return journey was not a victory lap, it was a race against a biological fuse. They were no longer just travelers, they were carriers of a fragile, living secret. Every day spent on the road increased the probability of the eggs being crushed, overheating, or succumbing to rot. The monks also had to contend with the reality that their prolonged absence might have raised suspicions. If the Sassanid officials had caught wind of 2 Roman monks lingering too long in the silk-producing regions of the east, the return through Persian territory would be a gauntlet. As they re-entered the outer rim of the Sassanid influence, attention shifted. The monks adopted a pace of grueling consistency. They avoided the larger caravansaries where news traveled fast, preferring the isolation of the high plateaus. The boring details of their track, the exact weight of their staffs, the rationing of their water, the meticulous cleaning of their feet to prevent infection, were the only things keeping the mission from total collapse. They were moving through a world that was unaware that its economic foundation was being carried past them in 2 pieces of wood. Justinian, back in Constantinople, was embroiled in the complexities of the Gothic War and the lingering effects of the Great Plague, yet the success of these 2 men was perhaps more vital to the empire's long-term survival than any battlefield victory in Italy. The monks were now crossing the high passes of the Pamir Mountains, where the air was thin and the cold was an ever-present threat to the dormant life within their staffs. They were halfway home, but the most dangerous part of the heist was just beginning. The eggs were alive, the Persians were watchful, and the road to the Mediterranean was still 1,000 miles of uncertainty.
The descent from the Pamir Mountains was not a triumphant march, but a grueling exercise in gravity and temperature management. As the monks moved from the freezing heights toward the arid lowlands of Sogdia, the primary threat shifted from the frost that might kill the embryos to the warmth that might wake them. This was the delicate balance of the biological clock they carried. If the Silkworm eggs hatched now, in the middle of a rocky plateau hundreds of miles from the nearest mulberry grove, the mission would end not with a bang, but with a faint, microscopic whimper of starving larvae. To prevent this, the monks traveled primarily at night, burying their staves deep in the shaded earth during the blistering midday heat, or seeking the cool, damp interiors of caravanserais, where the stone walls held the memory of winter. This was the reality of the heist. It was not a high-speed chase, but a slow-motion preservation act performed by 2 men whose knees were beginning to fail them. The Sassanid Empire, under the reign of the formidable Khosrow I, was at the height of its administrative efficiency. For the monks, this was a logistical nightmare. A disorganized empire is relatively easy to slip through, but a well-oiled machine requires a different set of survival skills, namely the ability to be completely and utterly uninteresting. To a Sassanid border official at Merv or Hecatopolis, 2 elderly Nestorian monks were merely part of the background noise of the Silk Road. They were the human equivalent of dust. They carried no taxable silks, no precious gems, and no weaponized metals. Their poverty was their greatest camouflage. When questioned, they spoke of spiritual matters, of the light of the East, and of their desire to return to the holy sites of the West. They played perfectly into the officials' bias that monks were harmless, eccentric, and economically irrelevant. The officials looked at the men, looked at their hollowed-out bamboo staves, which functioned as standard walking aids, and saw nothing worth the effort of a thorough search. History often forgets the sheer volume of calluses involved in such an undertaking. We calculate the distance in miles, but the monks calculated it in individual steps. Each monk would have taken approximately 4 million steps between Khotan and Constantinople. The maintenance of their sandals was as critical as the maintenance of the eggs. A broken strap or a worn-out sole could lead to a blister, an infection, and eventually a dead monk on the side of the road. We must imagine them every evening, using small amounts of precious water or scavenged animal grease to treat the leather of their footwear, their minds occupied not with the grand geopolitical shift they were facilitating, but with the immediate integrity of a cowhide thong. It is in these minute, repetitive actions that the foundations of empires are truly built. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the city was a crucible of anxiety. Justinian's court was waiting for a sign that did not come. In the mid-6th century, information moved at the speed of a horse, and once the monks had vanished into the east, they had effectively ceased to exist to the Roman administration. Justinian was currently managing the fallout of the bubonic plague, which had decimated his tax base and his armies. The Gothic War in Italy was dragging into a stalemate, and the treasury was draining at an unsustainable rate. To the emperor, the prospect of domestic silk production was no longer just a luxury, it was a matter of fiscal survival. Every gold solidus paid for silk was a coin that would eventually fund a Sassanid cataphract's armor. The boring theft of these eggs was the only weapon Justinian had that didn't require a sword he couldn't afford to forge. As the monks entered the heart of the Sassanid Empire, the tension thickened. They were now in the lion's den, traversing the Persian royal road.
They bypassed Ctesiphon, the magnificent Persian capital, staying to the fringes of the main trade arteries where they could. They were moving through the cradle of civilization, through lands that had seen the passage of Alexander and the clash of legions, yet their focus remained narrowed to the internal temperature of 2 pieces of wood. They had to account for the increasing humidity of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. Excess moisture could lead to mold, which would be as lethal to the eggs as the heat. The monks developed a routine of venting the staves in the dry air of the desert before entering the more humid river zones, a primitive form of climate control that required a deep, intuitive understanding of the biology they were smuggling. The bureaucracy of the 6th century was a slow parchment for the affair. The monks had to navigate the complex web of travel permits required to move between Persian provinces. This involved waiting. Days, sometimes weeks, spent in the sun-baked courtyards of provincial governors, waiting for a seal to be applied to a scrap of animal skin. These periods of waiting were perhaps the most dangerous times for the heist. Idle talk in a caravanserai was a constant hazard. A single slip of the tongue, a mention of the specific mulberry varieties of the Tarim Basin or the texture of a Cotonese cocoon, could alert a savvy merchant or a Persian spy to their true purpose. They survived by cultivating an aura of profound, almost aggressive dullness. They were the men nobody wanted to talk to at dinner, the travelers whose stories were so repetitive and pious that people actively avoided them. By the time they reached the borders of Roman Mesopotamia, the monks were shadows of the men who had left years prior. Their skin was like weathered parchment, their eyes clouded by the dust of 3,000 miles. But the eggs remained. They were nearing the fortress city of Dera, the gateway to the Byzantine world. This was the final hurdle. The border between the Sassanids and the Byzantines was a militarized zone, a landscape of watchtowers and patrols. Even for boring monks, the crossing would be scrutinized. The Sassanids were increasingly wary of Roman espionage. Any traveler moving toward the Roman frontier was a potential threat. The monks knew that if they were caught now, with the stolen seeds of China's greatest secret, they would not merely be executed, they would be the cause of a diplomatic catastrophe that could ignite a total war. The biological clock was ticking louder now. The warmth of the Mediterranean spring was approaching, and the eggs were beginning to stir within their wooden cocoons. The monks could feel the weight of history in their hands, but more importantly, they could feel the fragility of the life they carried. They were standing on the edge of the Roman world, looking toward a future where the silk industry would belong to the West. But the gate at Dera was closed, and a Persian patrol was approaching their position, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The most difficult transition, from smugglers back into the arms of an empire, was about to begin. The final 1,000 yards would prove more treacherous than the previous 1,000 miles.
The Persian captain, his skin cured to the texture of leather, reined in his horse. The dust kicked up by the patrol's hooves coated the monks' habits, a final layer of grime on a journey to find by it. One monk, his nerves made of iron, tightened his grip on the hollow bamboo staff. Inside, thousands of eggs were reacting to the warmth of his palm. If the captain ordered a search, the game was over. If he knocked the staves against a rock and heard the rattle of the eggs, Eastern secrets would be spilled onto the dirt. The horses snorted, their nostrils flaring at the strange smell of organic life within the wood. The captain spoke in raspy Persian. He asked for their purpose and destination. The monks, playing the role of weary travelers, gestured toward the horizon where the fortifications of Dara loomed like a mirage. They spoke of holy sites and the poverty that had accompanied them from afar. It was a performance fueled by knowing that a single tremor in their voices could trigger a search. The captain lingered, scanning their baggage. To him, they were merely 2 more drifting souls in a world full of them. He signaled his men to move on, the patrol disappearing into a cloud of ochre dust, leaving the monks alone with their own frantic heartbeats. They didn't run. Running invited a second look from the towers. Instead, they maintained their rhythmic, agonizingly slow pace. Every step was a calculation of thermal equilibrium. They had to keep the eggs warm enough to stay alive, but cool enough to prevent a premature hatching before they reached the imperial nurseries. As they crossed the invisible line that marked the beginning of Roman jurisdiction, there was no fanfare. There was only the sudden transition from the fear of execution to the weight of imperial expectation. They were greeted by a Byzantine scouting party who, upon seeing the signet from Justinian's agents, fell into a protective formation. The smugglers were now the empire's most valuable assets. The final leg of the journey to Constantinople was conducted with military urgency. They bypassed the slower merchant caravans, riding on fresh horses provided by the imperial postal service. They galloped past the olive grove for Anatolia, their staffs strapped tight against their bodies like holy relics. As they neared the capital, the air grew humid and salt-tinged, the Marmara scent signaling the end of their 2-year odyssey. When they finally stood before the bronze gates of the great palace, they were not the same men who had departed. They were weathered, scarred, and carrying a burden that would dismantle an ancient economic order. Justinian did not meet them in the throne room. He was a ruler who had reconquered Africa and Italy, yet he trembled at insects. Instead, the meeting took place in a private garden, away from the prying eyes of ambassadors. The emperor, in the twilight of his reign, watched in silence as the monks unscrewed the caps of their bamboo staffs.
From the hollow chambers, they poured out what looked like nothing more than grayish-black grains of sand. To a casual observer, it was a pathetic yield for 2 years of peril. But Justinian, a man who understood the power of infrastructure, saw the seeds of a new era. The next phase was the most delicate, the hatching. The boring history of the silk trade often ignores the sheer biological difficulty of this moment. The eggs required a specific temperature, roughly 75 degrees, to trigger the emergence of the larvae. Byzantine scholars and imperial gardeners, working under the monks' direction, used the warmth of compost heaps and regulated braziers to simulate the spring of the Sarandian valleys. And then it happened. The eggs began to crack. Tiny, dark caterpillars emerged into a world thousands of miles from their home. But the heist was not yet complete. A silkworm without a mulberry tree is merely a dying insect. Justinian had prepared for this, having ordered the cultivation of white mulberry trees across the warmer provinces years in advance. The monks began the grueling process of feeding the larvae. For 30 days, the silkworms did nothing but eat, growing to 10,000 times their initial weight. The sound of thousands of silkworms munching on leaves in the imperial nurseries was described by later chroniclers as a soft pitter-patter, like rain on a distant roof. As the worms began to spin their cocoons, weaving a single continuous thread of silk nearly a mile long, the Byzantine monopoly was born. The secret was out. Within a decade, the imperial workshops were producing silk that rivaled the quality of Chinese imports. The Silk Road remained, but its terminal point had shifted. The Persians, grown wealthy by taxing the transit of silk, suddenly found themselves bypassed. The economic leverage that the East held over the West began to erode, thread by thread. The silk industry became a state-controlled powerhouse. The emperor dictated the prices, the colors, and the export quotas. Purple silk, dyed with the expensive secretion of the murex snail, became the ultimate symbol of Roman authority, now produced entirely within the walls of Constantinople. The monks faded into shadows of the monasteries, their names unrecorded, their mission accomplished. They had stolen a